Ross Tucker, CBS Westwood One color analyst and the former NFL offensive lineman, has a podcast called Even Money, a betting podcast. Are you any good at gambling or giving gambling advice?
You know what, Dan? I actually am pretty decent at it. I've been doing it now for 7 or 8 years. Thank goodness that I started this. It's funny because I started the Ross Tucker football podcast like 10 years ago. And then all my buddies, all they did was talk about fantasy football. So I started a Fantasy Feast podcast. And then several of them, all they did was talk about betting. I don't know where they were doing it or whether or not it was legal when they were doing that. So I started the Even Money betting podcast. And of course, that's like the most popular one now. And I do pretty well. Yeah. Now, my co-host, Steve Fezzik, is a professional bettor in Vegas. He's the 2-time winner of the Super Contest. So he typically does better than me, but we're both very much in the black over the years. I'm having a better year than him so far this year, though.
How aware of the point spread were you when you played?
Not very. Like almost not at all. And to the point where the only time I ever thought about it was when maybe a coach brought it up as disrespectful. Although I will say this, Dan, I don't know why, but when I was a freshman at Princeton, 97, they had betting lines for the Ivy League games. I don't know if they still do or not. So my first game, we're playing at Cornell, and I'm on the punt team and the field goal team. And that week, my dad calls me up, and he says, "Hey, Ross, if I give you the signal, let your guy block the punt." And I was like, what? And so he told me, he was joking, obviously, but he told me what the spread was for the game. And I guess a lot of the Wall Street guys or whatever bet on Ivy League.
Yeah.
So, but it is crazy, Dan. I'm 18 years. I just turned 18 in March, just had my prom. It's like August or September. It is wild at the time to think about, like, wait a minute. There are people wagering money on whether or not I block. I've never even been on the punt team before. Whether or not I block this guy on punt, like there's people that determines their money. It was actually made me think a lot back in 1997. Kind of wild.
Seton, give Ross the poll question from hour one and see how he'd respond.
Biggest winner this weekend. Your options are Brian Kelly, Robert Saleh, Georgia football, Justin Fields, Marcus Freeman, or Geno Smith. Biggest winner this weekend.
Or if you want to add to that list.
Yeah. I think the first two that jumped out to me, I think it's Brian Kelly and Marcus Freeman. You know, college football is so interesting where it's like you really need that signature win, especially at home. And people, can sustain that for a year or two just based on that. So Brian Kelly getting a win over Alabama in his first year is gigantic. They never beat Alabama, only the one Joe Burrow year. And then for Freeman, they've had some bad losses. I mean, you lose to Marshall, you lose to Stanford. He needed that in the worst way for Notre Dame fans to feel better about him as a head coach. I feel like as a player, Justin Fields is obviously ascending. Geno Smith's one of the most incredible stories of the year, and I absolutely love it. But players, I feel like, are almost a little bit more on a week-to-week, and it's not as much of a signature win as it is for a college coach. I mean, those guys will both be at their respective schools for like 2 more years now at a minimum. I know it's their first year, but 2 more years at a minimum just because remember when he beat Clemson, though? Remember when he beat Alabama? That's the way college football rolls.
Now the poll question for hour 2, see.
The flip side of that, with the all due respect option, biggest loser this weekend, the Raiders, Nick Saban, Aaron Rodgers, the city of Philadelphia, Cliff Kingsbury, or the Rams.
I think it's Aaron Rodgers, actually. I think it's Aaron Rodgers. That was the worst football game I've ever seen him play. I actually asked on Twitter at Ross Tucker NFL if there's a worse game. He never throws like red zone or end zone interceptions. He had 3, and all 3 were 1,000% his fault. All 3 were terrible throws. He even missed an open receiver on a deep post where he threw the ball late and it got batted down. So worst I've seen him play. They're 3-6. They're not going to the playoffs. This is probably his last year in Green Bay. This is how it will end for him, which isn't well. Rashawn Gary's done for the year. If I talk to David Bakhtiari, who's out of the game again with his knee, I would tell him if he was my brother, I would tell him never play football again. It's a mess right now in Green Bay, and it's going to ending, it feels like, really, really poorly for him there.
Here's a number for you. In 2020 and 2021, Aaron Rodgers had 377 pass attempts against NFC North teams. 0 interceptions. In the first 36 minutes of the game on Sunday, 23 pass attempts, 3 interceptions against the Lions. That's amazing. Amazing.
That's a crazy stat. I don't have that much sympathy for his situation, Dan, because he wasn't there all off season, right? Like, now I don't know what happened with Devontae Adams. Evidently, he and Derek Carr are good friends. Do I think Devontae Adams would have left Green Bay if Tom Brady was the quarterback of the Packers? No, I don't think he would have. I think Devontae Adams would probably still be in Green Bay. But that's neither here nor there. Aaron Rodgers,
yeah, but do you think he left because of Rodgers, or do you think he left because of his friendship with Derek Carr?
I think he left because of his friendship with Derek Carr. I think his relationship with the Packers and/or Rodgers wasn't enough to be able to sway or compel him to stay. Like, I feel this is just my perception, right, Dan? I think Rodgers and Devontae Adams probably had a conversation, and Devontae said, look, I grew up a Raiders fan. Green Bay's messing with me with the money. I want to go out
Yeah, but
to the
didn't
West
they
Coast.
offer him more money than the Raiders did?
Eventually,
Okay.
at the end.
All right. Well,
But I think it had gone a bad way when they had kind of lowballed him earlier. But this is just a perception. I have no inside information, but I feel like Rodgers would probably be like, you know what, man, I get it. Best of luck to you. Whereas having played with Brady, I feel like Brady, Dan, would have been like, the hell you are. No, you're not. And like convince Devontae to stay and put the full court press on and make it unacceptable for him to leave. I just feel like they have very different personalities.
he's Ross Tucker, CBS Westwood One color analyst, host of the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. Give me the teams that are done that might surprise people that you think. Well, you mentioned Green Bay. Green Bay's not making the playoffs, right? They got Dallas coming to town next weekend. See, if they beat Dallas, then all of a sudden, hey, 4-6, you're not going to win the division because of the Vikings. But the NFC is kind of like top heavy. But so Green Bay's not making the playoffs according to you, right?
Yeah, I think they're done.
All right.
And I know people say, well, how are you going to get 7 teams? Well, right now it looks like there's 3 teams from the NFC East, and with the way they're playing. And then I think the NFC West gets 2. I think, the Niners, the way they played their last game out, I'd be surprised if they don't get 9 or 10 wins.
Do you think the Rams?
I don't think the Packers are making the playoffs.
Are the Rams making the playoffs?
No, I think they're done as well. Yeah, I think they're, Dan, if the Bucs had lost yesterday, I think they still could have won the NFC South potentially.
Mm-hmm.
But the Rams losing, the way in which they lost, now they're looking way up at both the Seahawks and the Niners. It's kind of crazy because I think the Rams and the Packers are both as close to done as you can be in whatever we are, just finishing up week 9.
Raiders are done.
Yeah, and Dan, look, I'm not here to kill Josh McDaniels at all, but I don't understand why they ever got rid of Bisaccia. I mean, it was his only sample size as a head coach. It was after the Henry Ruggs incident. It was after all the Gruden emails. He gets the job midway through. They win all those close games. They get to the playoffs. Even in the playoff game, Derek Carr's on the goal line against the Bengals. They almost won that. They almost beat the Bengals who went to the Super Bowl. I guess I don't understand the logic, Dan. if you're Mark Davis, maybe Bisaccia is not the guy. Maybe you give him a 3-year deal, and if it goes poorly, you fire him after 1. But the only sample size for Bisaccia as a head coach in the NFL was really, really good. The only sample size we had for McDaniels as a head coach in the NFL in Denver was terrible. So the idea to just get rid of Mayock and Bisaccia and bring in McDaniels, I don't know who got that in Mark Davis's head or if it was in his head, but it's been a disaster. I mean, the Raiders season has been an absolute 3 games, you're up by 17 points or more and you lose.
Yeah.
On some level, that's coaching.
Yeah, I just wonder, Denver, a lot of people like them as a dark horse to be a Super Bowl contender. Certainly playoffs, they seem to be done. Anybody else that you would throw in the mix that
well, Pittsburgh,
Cardinals?
obviously, but I think we already know that.
Cardinals?
The Chargers have this. Not only do the Chargers play the same game every week, Dan, they have the same season every season.
I know.
Can you imagine me? The Chargers are like watching that pretty decent but not great movie over and over and over again.
Yeah, like Sex in the City, the movie. It's not any good, but people still watch it over. Not that I do, but people. Have you watched Sex in the City, the movie?
I have not watched Sex in the City, the movie, I don't think, but I watched the show a decent amount because when my wife and I were dating, she was living in New York, 2001 to 2006. I was Washington, Dallas, Buffalo, and that was like the hot show at the time. I liked the brunette. What's her name? Kristen Davis?
Yeah.
That would have been like, if you're asking me which one of the
I was
about to call them the housewives that I would have picked, that would have been that was the one I liked. I liked her segments. Although I like the attitude of the blonde one. I like the mentality of the older blonde one.
Kim Cattrall?
Yes, I liked her mentality, but I liked the brunette in terms of appearance. Sarah Jessica Parker never did that much for me either way. And she was always like pondering stuff and, I don't know what to do. Should I go with Mr. Big or like the dude with the hair? Wasn't into that at all. Wasn't into Sarah Jessica Parker.
I didn't.
I have not thought of that show for 1 second in 15 years. This is why next year you're winning the award. I know you're in the Hall of Fame now, but this is why next year you guys are winning the Emmy. You need to submit the last 3 minutes. We're getting it this year. The heck with Good Morning Football. They can't hold a candle to those last 3 minutes.
I met some guy over the weekend, and he said, "You know why you don't win the sports Emmy?" And I go, "No." He goes, "Well, you don't talk sports." And I said, "Oh, okay." And he goes, "I mean that as a compliment. That, to win the sports Emmy, you got to talk sports." And I thought, "Oh, okay. What a novel approach here." So, I just lost the sports
whatever
Emmy.
You're doing, man, whatever you're doing it right. Every time I'm in an airport, at least one person will say to me, "I'm a big fan." And I'll always be like, "Oh, is it my podcast? Is it me on calling the games for CBS or what?" They're like, no, Dan Patrick Show.
Yeah.
I'm like, my guest segment or like the 3 times a year I fill in? Yeah, that's it. I'm like, okay, cool. I'll take it.
Who labeled you the meathead James Vanderbeek? Was that one of my listeners?
Or Paulie, I think. Either one of the listeners or Paulie.
I don't think Paulie would say something like that.
I wish I could take credit for that.
Yeah.
It was definitely a caller.
So meathead James Vanderbeek.
Which, by the way, it's so funny, Dan, when people call me a meathead, I think they want me to be like offended. Like, as long as you say Ivy League meathead, I'm fine with that. I went to the best school in the country, but I appreciate the finer things in life. Beer, food, talking about football.
Sarah Jessica Parker.
Somebody every once in a while. What's wrong with that?
Sex in the City. Yeah, all.
Sex in the City, Kristen Davis with Cattrall's mentality and mindset. Exactly.
It's always good to talk to you, man. Oh, you got
always, man. I look forward to it.
You got Maction tomorrow night, don't you?
Tomorrow night, my 3rd game in the last 6 days. I did Texans Eagles Thursday night for Westwood. I did San Diego State UNLV Saturday night, and tomorrow night, Dan, I want everyone to take their duty to the country seriously. Tomorrow on Election Day, and watch Eastern Michigan at Akron, 7 p.m. on CBS Sports Network.
Okay.
That's their duty. That's the joke. Forget going to the polls. Make sure you watch. Don't be watching because they don't know who wins until like midnight anyway.
Yeah.
7 to 10:30, Eastern Michigan, Akron. Maction's hilarious. It's amazing. I love it.
That's Tuesday night. And you know what? They did a great job marketing that you get a standalone game and people will watch. If this game was over the weekend, you wouldn't get any audience. But
Dan, you would be amazed how many tweets and how many text messages I will get tomorrow night. I'll get text messages from like NFL head coaches or GMs just because they get home or they have it on in the background. It's genius, which by the way, Dan, my idea, okay, somebody needs to play a Saturday morning 10 a.m. game. I've told Paulie and the Danettes this. Saturday, maybe it's the Ivy League. Maybe it's like the CAA, UNH and Delaware and Richmond and whatever. If there's a game Saturday morning, people would watch it.
Hey, by the way, I had my source who told me this over the weekend. San Diego State getting ready to join the Pac-12.
That is a rumor. Yes, that is a rumor.
Well, I was told that it was going to happen.
Me.
They would probably make the announcement this week, but
that would not surprise me. Dan, after the Padres, they're the second biggest thing in town. They got a brand new stadium. San Diego's an awesome city. They have the stadium. Marshall Faulk was there. It's right where Qualcomm was.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're the Pac-12 and you're looking to add, San Diego State's a pretty obvious ad.
Safe travels. Always great to talk to you. Thank you, Ross.
Absolutely. See you, Dan.
That's Ross Tucker. He's got a betting podcast called Even Money and, of course, the Ross Tucker Football Podcast.